Job's a righteous man, but God doesn't owe him anything. And God already knew of his righteousness and was satisfied with Job. But God was going to show up and come when God got ready, not when Job says that God needed to show up. High is not calamity for the unrighteous and disaster for the workers of um, iniquity. And so Job says he made a covenant with his eyes that he wasn't going to lust. That's a part of what Job did in being pure. Um, Job says this is what he would deserve if impurity ruled his heart in verses 4 through 8. He says, if I walked with falsehood and my foot hastened to deceit, let me be weighed in a just balance and let God know my integrity. If my step turned aside from the way and my heart had gone after my eyes, and if any spot stuck to my hands, then let me sow and another eat, and let what grows from me be rooted out. He's saying, if I did anything wicked, then Job says, God sees all my steps, but if I have engaged in deceit, I want God to weigh me in the balance and I want God to expose me. That's what he says in verse 6. So Job is inviting inspection from God. Job is saying, I want God to see me as I truly am, to inspect me, and to examine my life to see whether or not I've done wrong. And Job can be confident that he's done what's right. He doesn't claim that he's never done wrong, but that he basically says, if he had ever done wrong, he repented of the wrong. Job believes if he had done wrong, then he deserves to suffer for it by having his land and his profit enjoyed by somebody else. In verses 7 and 8, if my step is turned aside from the way and my heart has gone after my eyes, if any spot has stuck to my hands, he's saying, if I've done wrong, somebody else can take my property. In verses 9 through 12, he talks about avoiding the sin of adultery. And Job says if he's committed adultery or taken his neighbor's wife, basically in verses 9 through 10, he's saying, may the same thing happen for him. Um, and then he talks about the treatment of his servants. And finally, in 21 through 23, or generosity toward the needy in verses 16 through 20. And then he talks about peace toward the defenseless in verses 21 through 23. All right. That's followed by a refusal to trust in riches in verses 24 and 25. He rejected idolatry in verses 26 through 28. He treated his enemies properly in verses 29 through 30. He showed hospitality towards strangers, 31 and 32. He had personal piety and holiness in verses 33 and 34. And then he concludes with his thoughts and a challenge to anybody that would examine his life. And this is how he does that. This is Job 31, 35 through 40. Job 31, 35 through 40. He says, oh, that I had one to hear me. Here is my signature. Let the Almighty answer me. Oh, that I had the indictment written by my adversaries. Surely I would carry it on my shoulder. I would bind it on me as a crown. I would give him an account of all my steps. Like a prince, I would approach him. If my land has cried out against me, and its furrows have wept together, if I have eaten its yield without payment, and made its owners breathe their last, let thorns grow instead of. Oh, okay. No problem, David. Let thorns grow instead of wheat and foul weeds instead of barley. The words of Job are ended. And so Job signs off in two ways here. In one sense, he's signaling that the legal document of his innocence, if he'd done anything wrong, he's saying, hey, this is it. If anybody knows anything I've done, let me know. But he also is signing off from speaking because Job won't be doing anything else. He's saying, I be condemned if I've done these things, but I haven't. So I really have nothing else to say. That's how he ends his speech. All right. Here's the final observations from Job's speech. Here's some things to take away from chapter 31. Okay. Here's the final observations from Job's speech. Number one, live in such a way that you might have a resume like Job. Live in a way that you can have a resume like Job. His pedigree and his righteousness is impressive here. Job has done the right thing. Job has lived the right way. And there's nothing anybody can charge Job with because Job has done what's right. Here's number two. Purity starts in the heart. Much of what Job says is picked up on by Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus says in Matthew 5 and verse 8, blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Or he talks about lust in Matthew 5, and he says, if you look on a woman with lustful intent, you've already committed adultery in your heart. And Job is saying, I've made a covenant with my eyes. I wouldn't look on a virgin. So purity starts in the heart. Number three, Job lived in view of the audience of one. Everything he did was to please God or in fear of God. And we need both to balance out our lives. Fear before God allows us to be fearless before men. And a desire to please God removes a crippling desire to please men. Our whole lives don't have to be about how other people are going to see us or what they're going to think about us. We can think about how we ultimately can honor God and what that means above all else. Next, Job prioritized his priorities. Though he was rich and he was a wealthy businessman, he used it all in service to God, not in order to sacrifice his relationship with God. So Job was rich and prosperous and a successful businessman, but none of that stopped his relationship with God. He used all of those things so that he could ultimately live his life to glorify God. Next, there is a time in our lament to pour out our hearts and then be quiet and see how God responds to our prayer requests. So Job poured out his heart. Job saying he's frustrated. He wants all these answers. But then finally, Job gets to a point where he says, I'm done talking, and I'm going to let God do the rest of the talking. And Job knows his place and sees where he stands before God. And here's the last thing. Nobody gets to summon God. Nobody gets to say, God, show up, and then God has to do exactly what they say. So it's funny, Job stops speaking, and then God doesn't show up right away. There's these 6 chapters of Elihu. There's 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, those 6 chapters in between. And maybe those chapters are there so that it's not the case that Job just can make God do whatever he wants. Job's a righteous man, but God doesn't owe him anything. And God already knew of his righteousness and was satisfied with Job. But God was going to show up and come when God got ready, not when Job says that God needed to show up. All right. Any questions about Job's final words here or Job's speech in chapter 31? Any questions about Job's speech? All right. Good. So now let's look at a man by the name of Elihu. We don't know anything about this man, but let me say a few words about chapters 32 down through 37. Anyone who's read the first 31 chapters at this point, you're ready for God to speak and it to be over, right? Everybody has done their talking. Everybody has said their part, but there's one more man left to speak. All right. So just when you think God will show up and speak, a young man comes on the scene and speaks in an unusual way for over 5 chapters. All right. Every commentary on the book of Job has to deal with Elihu's speeches. And we all recognize as we read chapters 32 through 37, these are really some of the most challenging chapters in Job because people are trying to wonder, is Elihu right in what he says in chapters 32 through 37? He's a new man that's introduced and that's talking. Is he right about how he's going about things, or is Elihu in the wrong? God doesn't say anything about his speeches. Job never gets to respond to him. So there's a lot of challenge with what he says. I think you can make the case that Elihu is either number one, Elihu comes on the scene and promises to do something different, but he doesn't come through, or there's no critique by God when he later rebukes the friends because his speech is the best we've had so far. So either Elihu's speeches are the best that we've had so far, so when God shows up, he doesn't correct anything with him, or it's the case that he doesn't do anything different, and so when God shows up, he just ignores his speeches altogether. One of those is probably correct.